So now we continue with the exterior work on the PT-11. I let the second fill coat cure for a couple days. It happened to be a weekend, so that worked out well. And right now I've just spent part of the morning sanding the fill coat with a palm sander first with 80 and 120 grit, staying away from the corners, just doing the flats. So I sanded them with the 80 and 120, and then I went over it by hand with 120 on a small sanding block and just by hand on the corners, like these chines. It's come out pretty well so far. I didn't go crazy on the bulkhead edge here, where it's going to join the forward half, because the next step is I'm going to connect the two halves again, and I'll sand over that gap to make sure that it's nice and fair when the boat is connected. And I also haven't sanded the top edge of this gunnel glass here. That needs to be flattened with the top of the gunnel. I'll do that once I flip this over. But I did do the underside here, and I sanded this flat by hand over the sheathing that I put on there. A few places where I put on this fairing compound, there might be a low spot, like right here. So a little bit of work. This seam here, there's a tiny bit of texture there. So I'll probably do a little quick fairing here and there. Transom looks good. I haven't done the top edge yet. Once I turn the boat over, I'll clean that up a little bit. But I'm happy with how it looks at this point. It looks, in some places, like maybe you can see here, there's a little, it looks like it might be lumpy. It's actually not. So that looks funny, but it's actually completely smooth and flat. So we've got a few spots like that that look that way. Otherwise, it looks good. Same on the bow section. Again, a few spots like this. There's actually a little bit of a hump here. I've sanded that about as flat as I want to, so that'll take just a touch of filler. That one's actually smooth. It doesn't look like it, but it is. The stem area came out pretty well. There's probably a little touch-up because I have a couple trowel marks here from when I put in this fairing compound before the final fill coat. That stuff's all to be expected. So overall, this hull is 90% there. This side looks real nice. Again, on the bulkhead end here, I brought the fiberglass flush with a block sand, but I haven't gone crazy. I did sand this lightly, but I haven't gone crazy. When I connect the two halves, I'll just sand this by hand. Make sure that it's nice and fair across, and these gunnel ends too. Sanded out the inside of this daggerboard trunk a little bit. I put these little fillets in there before I glassed, but I hadn't touched those since. So that's pretty much ready to go. I have to do the opposite side on the foredeck when I turn the boat over in a few minutes. I reconnected the hull at the seam before I turned it over, and then I turned it over upside down like this so that I could just fair in that seam and the gunnels and make sure everything was good there. So I just used a sanding block and went over this seam. It's basically there, but this just took care of the little bit of last sanding that I had left. So I didn't sand too much at the ends of these hulls before I connected it, just to make sure that this seam stayed nice and flush. And I sanded these gunnel areas so that they were flush on all three sides. This one has a tiny gap here. This isn't completely tightened here. I can see that those could have come in a little bit more. And then I did a little bit of a very light round over on both of these corners. Before I turned the hull over, I had sanded the top edge of that gunnel to bring the glass down flush. There are pictures of that in the log, but not on this video. So I didn't sand much else on the hull once I had it connected. It was mostly about that seam. The other side here, same thing. Just went over it. And I hope you can tell that that's flat and flush. because it is. Very happy with it. Again, sanded these gunnels while they were connected so that these stay perfectly aligned. And a little bit of a round over on both sides, just to ease, kind of break that corner so it isn't too sharp, but I didn't go too crazy on it because I didn't want to sand through the glass. And the rest of the hull hasn't changed since I turned it over. I did the rest of the sanding before I connected it. While the hull was upright, both before and after connecting it, mostly before connecting it together, I cleaned up these edges. I'd already sanded this glass that I put on the gunnel tops and other places before I glassed the hull. So I brought the gunnel edge, the new glass on the gunnel edge, flush with that, and cleaned up these edges a little bit as needed. And around the breast hook here, and all the way down and around the in whale. This glass that wrapped over from the transom, I'm going to have to do a little fairing compound in here because there was no other provision for cleaning that edge up, and I can't sand it flat. So I'll just put on some fairing compound in the near future, clean that up. These ends where the fabric on the gunnels wrapped around, they're going to need a little bit more fairing. There's a low spot here. So I'll fair that in on both sides. But otherwise, these gunnels are all flat. Both edges have a slight little chamfer round over on them. And the top surfaces that are glassed are flat and smooth. So everything's looking pretty good. The skeg is all ready to go. It's over here. I didn't video any of this before, but it's got a layer of 6-ounce cloth on both sides. There's a fiberglass shoe on the bottom, epoxied and glassed in place. And the trailing edge has this solid epoxy end. It's also detailed in the logs, but not here. It's got a little flat on the aft side. So this is ready to go. It's been sanded smooth, fill coated and sanded smooth. And this is going to go obviously on the bottom of the hull and into these slots that you see here in the bottom. So that's coming up as well. Since the hull's all sanded and I'm happy with it overall, I could go ahead and install this skeg. It's installed with glue, epoxy glue, and the alignment slots that were in the bottom of the boat. And there's 3 screws holding it. 2 from beneath up into those tongues, and then 1 that I'll show you in a minute up at the forward end that goes from the outside end. So it's glued in with the regular gluing mix, and since it was nice and stable, I went ahead and did a nice fillet with the fairing mix or filleting mix. So one and done on this, little sanding later, and then I went ahead and did some minor fairing on the 2 halves of the hull. That little seam, a couple places here on the transom that I talked about a little bit earlier, and a couple random spots here and there on the hull. There's the screw on the forward end holding that in. I'll take that out once this is cured. Over here on the bow, I added a little fairing compound to a couple places. Up here where the cloth ended, the lighter layer of cloth ended, a couple random places, and then this stem just needed a little touch up where I had filled it before. And down here near the gunnel there was a little bit of a low spot. It's a new day, and the skeg and various fairing compound cured overnight, and I've just sanded the fillets around the skeg and these other areas of fairing compound to bring everything back to where it should be. Skeg looks good. Fillets look good. There's a hole at the forward end to fill where I had a screw in place, and I have to fill the slots from the inside of the boat where the skeg is installed. That'll happen very soon. transom corners. Those have sanded out pretty well and are fair now with the rest of the transom. So this is pretty much it for prep on the outside of the hull before primer. Primer is going to be the next step on the exterior of the hull, although it's not going to happen right away. There's more work on the inside. But the exterior is done. It's smooth and fair. Everything's fill coated. These areas that I filled came out well. Nice and smooth. The little trowel marks from before are gone. This little spot on the stem here that I filled. It's just a little low spot where the gunnel glass here wrapped over the stem glass, so there was just a little hollow there. So that's done. These towing holes are good, nice and smooth. So this is it for the exterior of the hull. The next steps here are going to be primer and paint. It's now February 19th, 2025, and it's been a while since I did anything on the hull, the outside of the hull. My latest efforts since the beginning of the month, or the beginning of the year rather, have been pretty much focused on the interior and getting that through all the stages and final painted. So now it's time to turn to the hull. Most of the prep work's done. Little white paint here that I'll have to sand off and just a light touch up. There's a few scratches where I've been turning this around on the table and so forth. And a little bit of a hole to just completely fill under that tape. That's where the screw secured this skeg when I installed it. It's been filled once and it's filled from the other side. Just needs a little touch up on this side. And the bow section over here doesn't really need anything. I'm going to paint this epoxied area to match the hull color. So this needs a little bit of prep to clean up the edge where the deck paint ends, so I can create a clean transition. And I'll sand this epoxy. This is a gloss finish epoxy. I'll sand that so that it can accept primer and paint, because that just makes more sense in this case. Otherwise, the forward half is pretty much ready to go as it is. I'll do a little masking on the edges of this bulkhead and somewhere on the gunnel. Haven't quite decided. I have to look at the rub rail, the vinyl rub rail that goes on this, and see how big it is and how much, whether I should leave any hull color on the gunnel or just tape it at the edge here. Probably tape it at the edge. But I've set these up in a way that I can work on them. It's a little crowded over here at the moment. I'll probably adjust things before I get to the paint. But I'm quite anxious to get the primer and paint done on these hull sections. And then I can really wrap up this boat. It's pretty close. Just a few things to install on the interior once I get the hull painted. And that'll be coming up very soon. There were just a few little steps before these hulls were ready for primer on the exterior. I masked off the gunnels, as you can see here. Little extra masking over the rowlock risers. Masked inside this bulkhead edge. This bulkhead's already been primed. It might get another coat, just because. Gunnel's taped right up to the corner, so it'll be hull color below. And then on the transom here, I taped at this edge that I wrapped over the white paint. So that'll be the seam there. And then on the bow section, I taped the gunnel and around the stem. I have a couple pieces of tape on here just to ensure that the edge of the tape is below the top of the gunnel, so if any paint does drip over, it's not going to capillary over onto the painted gunnel. And back here, I sanded this epoxy on the bottom of this tongue, seat tongue, masked off around where I painted the white. And the same thing on these bulkheads on both sides. I've cleaned the hulls with solvent, and they are ready for primer right now. This is the primer coat on the hull exteriors. This went much better than inside the boat. A little more experience working with the paint, and it's much easier to work on this. Coated everything, including the bulkhead faces, which I had primed earlier. Came out pretty well. Hull looks good underneath. That's the main thing. This will get sanded later. But I'm pleased with how the hull looks. I'll sneak through between the two here. Show you the other side. So I'll let this cure and then sand it with like 220. Maybe 320 if I think I can get away with it before I do the top coats. This is Epiphane's 2-part primer, polyurethane primer system. Just like I used on the inside of the hull, at least half of it. Again, I painted the bulkheads again, I painted the transom again, and I painted the bottom of the seat tongue, which had been unfinished epoxy. Well, gloss finished epoxy, I should say. That'll be hull color. So there you have it. Primer coat.